Chained to the town, well, iron gone hot against her raw skin, left to bake in a Colorado sun. That was Josephine Hale, and it would change everything, because a quiet stranger nobody had bothered to notice was watching, and he was about to make every man in that square regret it. She hadn't screamed. Not once. Her name was Josephine. Folks called her Josie, and it was the autumn of 1885 in Colorado territory. If a story like this one has already got its hooks in you, do me the kindness of hitting subscribe, and drop me a line down in the comments telling me what town you're listening from tonight, and what time it is where you are. Pour something warm. Settle in, because this one runs long, and you will regret leaving before the last word. Now let's go on back to the beginning. Back to the week before the well. Back to when Josie Hale was just a woman minding her own business in a town that was about to prove it didn't deserve her. Ester Springs sat where the high plains started to buckle up into the first hard shoulders of the Rockies. A two-street town built around a spring that never ran dry even in the cruelest years, which was the only reason it existed at all. It had a mercantile, a livery, a saloon with a piano nobody tuned, a squat little church with a bell that cracked in '81 and rang flat ever since. And at the center of it, in the square where the two streets crossed, sat the town well, stone-ringed and deep, the reason the whole place had ever been worth settling. Autumn had come in dry that year. The cottonwoods along the creek, gone the color of old parchment, the wind carrying grit instead of rain, and the kind of heat that lingered into October like it was reluctant to let the year go. It was, on the whole, an unremarkable town, the sort of place a man could ride through and forget by the next county. It would not stay unremarkable long. Josie Hale was 26 years old that fall, dark-haired, quick in her movements, with the kind of steady gray eyes that made men uncomfortable when she looked straight at them instead of down at her hands, the way they expected. She'd come to Ester Springs 3 years prior as a bride, married to a freight line clerk named Daniel Hale who died of a fever the winter before last, leaving her a small clapboard house at the edge of town, a modest garden, and precisely nothing in savings, because Daniel had been a good enough man but a poor enough planner, and grief doesn't pay bills any better than love does. She'd kept herself afloat since then, doing what a widow with steady hands and no family nearby had to do, mending clothes, keeping books for the mercantile on Tuesdays and Fridays, baking pies. She sold out her kitchen window on Sunday mornings after church let out. She was, by any honest measure, exactly the kind of woman a decent town ought to have protected without being asked. Ester Springs was not, as it turned out, a decent town. Not underneath, not when it counted. What put Josie at that well in chains wasn't any crime, not really, though the men who did it dressed it up as one. She'd made the mistake, 3 weeks before, of turning down a marriage proposal from a man named Elias Combs, and Elias Combs was not built to absorb that kind of refusal gracefully. He ran the mercantile, held 2 mortgages on properties near the edge of town, including the note on Josie's own little house, and had decided somewhere in his own head that a woman in Josie's circumstances, a poor widow with debts and no menfolk to speak for her, ought to be grateful for whatever attention a man of his standing cared to offer, when she'd told him plainly, in front of his own counter, that she'd rather take in washing the rest of her days than marry a man who spoke to her the way he spoke to his mules. Combs had gone quiet and pale and furious, and men like Combs do not forget an insult delivered in public. He waited 3 weeks, patient the way only a truly petty man can be patient, and then he found his opening. The opening came in the shape of a lie, and it was a good one, because good lies always borrow just enough truth to make the whole thing swallow easy. A ledger had gone missing from the mercantile's back office, one recording a shipment of tinned goods in dry stores worth some $60, and Combs stood up in the middle of the Saturday crowd and announced, loud enough for the whole square to hear, that he'd seen Josie Hale slip into that back office 2 days prior under the pretense of dropping off his bookkeeping, and that the ledger had vanished the same afternoon. It wasn't true. Josie had been in that office because she did keep his books some Tuesdays, but she'd taken nothing, and the ledger, as it happened, had been misfiled by Combs's own nephew and sat gathering dust in a crate in the storeroom the whole while. None of that mattered once the accusation was loose in the square, because a lie shouted in public travels faster than any truth spoken quiet. And by that Saturday afternoon, half of Ester Springs had already decided Josie Hale was a thief before anyone had asked her a single honest question. It's worth pausing here, friend, to say plainly what kind of woman Josie actually was, because the men who chained her to that well never once bothered to ask. She'd nursed the Talbot boy through scarlet fever 2 winters back when his own mother was too exhausted to sit up another night, sitting bedside herself for 4 straight days on nothing but coffee and prayer. She'd forgiven 3 separate debts owed her by families hit hard by the previous year's drought, tearing up the paper herself rather than watch children go hungry over a few dollars. She read by lamplight most nights, kept a shelf of 6 books she guarded like they were gold, and dreamed, when she let herself dream at all, of saving enough to open a proper little schoolhouse for the handful of children in town whose parents couldn't spare the fare for the circuit teacher. She was not soft exactly. She was gentle, which is a different thing entirely, and gentle people get mistaken for weak by men who've never had to be either. By Monday morning, the accusation had curdled into something uglier, helped along considerably by 4 men in particular who each had their own reasons for wanting Josie Hale made an example of. And a story like this deserves its villains named plainly, because a lamb standing alone means nothing without the wolves arrayed against her. There was Elias Combs himself, the mercantile owner, vain and vindictive, a man whose cruelty wore the coat of wounded pride, and who'd convinced himself that punishing Josie publicly would restore whatever dignity he imagined she'd stripped from him in front of his own counter. There was Deputy Ambrose Kettle, the law in Ester Springs in the loosest possible sense, a lazy, bribable man who'd taken Combs's silver more than once over the years and saw no profit in questioning a story that came with his benefactor's blessing. There was a rancher named Otto Vrana, a big, blunt man who ran cattle on the flats north of town and carried a grudge against most everyone poorer than himself, delighted at any chance to remind a struggling widow exactly where she stood in his accounting of the world. And there was Silas Crabb, the undertaker, a thin, dry, whispering man who profited handsomely off the town's fear and misery both, and who'd spent years cultivating exactly the kind of quiet influence that let him nudge a mob's temper wherever suited him best. 4 separate poisons, cruelty, laziness, contempt, and manipulation, pouring together into the same well of injustice, and Josie Hale was about to be the one left standing at the bottom of it. There was a 5th man worth naming too, though he never touched a chain or raised his voice in the square, and in some ways his particular vice was the ugliest of the lot, precisely because it wore no obvious face at all. Judge Amos Whitlock held the circuit court's confidence in that stretch of the territory more on paper than in practice. A semi-retired magistrate who'd settled in Ester Springs to live out his years comfortably and had long since traded whatever backbone he'd once had for a quiet, well-fed peace with men like Combs, who kept him in good whiskey and better favors. Whitlock wasn't in town that week, off tending his gout at a hot springs 2 counties over, but it was his long-standing habit of looking the other way on Combs's smaller cruelties over the years that had taught Ester Springs, bit by bit, that a man with money could bend whatever passed for law there until it served him. Cowardice dressed up as neutrality is still cowardice, and Whitlock's particular flavor of it had done as much to build the rot in Ester Springs as any of the men standing in that square. Kettle never even bothered with a proper hearing. He walked Josie from her own kitchen Monday morning with her apron still tied at her waist, put her in the town's single jail cell for 1 night on Combs's word alone, and by Tuesday, with Combs whispering in his ear about how a public lesson would do more good for town order than a quiet trial ever could, he'd landed on the punishment himself: chain her to the town well in the square. Let the sun and the shame do the rest. 3 days. same as a horse thief might get out on the flats where nobody civilized was watching. It was, dressed up in official language, called a public correction, the sort of half-legal cruelty small towns without real law sometimes convince themselves is justice. It was, in plain truth, torture, meant less to punish a theft that never happened, and more to remind every other woman in Ester Springs exactly what happened to those who embarrassed a man like Combs. Word of it traveled the way word does, in a town that small, mouth to mouth over back fences and shop counters. And by the time Josie was actually walked out to the well Tuesday morning, most of Ester Springs already knew what was coming and had already, each in their own private way, decided they weren't going to be the one who stepped in front of it. That decision, made separately by dozens of ordinary people who might otherwise have called themselves decent, is its own kind of quiet machinery, and it ran that morning every bit as smooth as the machinery Combs had built to punish her. Tuesday morning, they walked her out to the square, wrists cuffed and iron rings bolted through a chain looped twice around the well's stone housing. A hand-lettered sign hung from a nail above her head reading TAFE in letters crude enough to read from 50 feet off. The whole town turned out to watch, or near enough. And here is the part that still shames Ester Springs whenever old-timers tell it. Nobody stopped it. The blacksmith watched from his open doorway and told himself it wasn't his place to interfere with the deputy's business. The school teacher pulled her curtains rather than let her students see it, which spared the children the sight, but not Josie the suffering. Women who'd shared quilting circles with Josie the winter before crossed to the far boardwalk rather than meet her eyes. Fear does that to good people sometimes, makes them smaller than they'd ever admit to being on an ordinary day. And Ester Springs discovered that Tuesday exactly how small its own decency could shrink when tested. By noon, the iron had gone from merely hot to something closer to branding, and Josie's lips had cracked at the corners from 3 hours without water, her wrists raw and weeping where she'd tested the chain in the first restless hour before she made herself stop, because struggling only wasted the strength she'd need later and drew blood she couldn't afford to lose. She didn't beg. She'd decided that inside the first half hour, quiet and resolute, because begging was a coin Combs wanted from her and she wasn't going to hand it over free of charge. She kept her chin up, her eyes forward, and endured the particular cruelty of being looked at by a whole town's worth of people who'd rather study their own boots than acknowledge what was happening 4 feet in front of them. Ought to have thought about that before you went sniffing through a man's ledgers, Verona said, passing close enough that his shadow fell over her. Close enough for her to smell the whiskey already working on him, though it wasn't yet noon. He laughed that particular laugh, cruel men use when they want an audience to laugh along, and 2 of his ranch hands obliged him, though even they wouldn't meet Josie's eyes doing it. Crabbe, for his part, made a show of pausing near the well on his way past, tipping his black hat with theatrical solemnity, murmuring something about how a town had to protect its good order, however unpleasant the method, and moved on with the satisfied air of a man who just delivered a benediction rather than watched a woman suffer. Combs himself came by twice that first day, each time lingering just long enough to be seen lingering, savoring something in Josie's discomfort that he told himself was justice, and was, underneath, simple spite, dressed up in a clean collar. By afternoon, a handful of children had gathered at the edge of the square despite their mother's best efforts to keep them elsewhere, drawn by the terrible magnetism cruelty holds for the young before they've learned to look away from it properly. And it was the sight of 2 of them, no older than 8 or 9, staring wide-eyed at Josie's cracked lips that finally put a knot in the stomach of more than one grown man standing idle nearby. Still, nobody moved. A widow named Constance Ruelle, who'd once shared a quilting frame with Josie, 2 winters running, stood at her own gate for the better part of an hour, hands twisting her apron, before finally turning back inside rather than risk Combs's displeasure falling on her own struggling farm. She would carry the shame of that hour for years afterward, longer, in fact, than Josie herself carried the physical hurt of the chains. What none of them noticed Not Combs preening near the well. Not Brana laughing with his ranch hands. Not Kettle dozing in the shade of the jailhouse porch he was meant to be minding. Was the stranger who'd ridden into Ester Springs 2 days prior and taken a room above the livery, a quiet man who kept mostly to himself, spoke little, and had spent that Tuesday morning leaned against the livery's shaded post with his hat brim low, watching the whole ugly business unfold with an attention nobody thought to notice, because nobody had thought to notice him at all since he arrived. His name, as far as Ester Springs knew it, was Boone. He'd ridden in from the west 2 days before on a rangy gray gelding, paid the liveryman in coin without haggling, and said almost nothing to anybody since beyond what courtesy required. He was somewhere in his late 30s, weathered past his years the way men get who spent long stretches under open sky, dressed plain. A canvas coat gone the color of dust, a hat that had clearly seen every kind of weather Colorado could offer. He didn't carry himself like a man looking for trouble, and he didn't carry himself like a man avoiding it either. He simply carried himself like a man who'd already decided, a long time ago, exactly how much of the world's noise was worth his attention, and had found so far that Ester Springs offered very little of it. That changed the moment they walked Josie Hale out to the well. Boone had moved from the livery post the whole first hour, watching with an expression that gave away nothing to anyone bothering to look, which nobody was. But something in his stillness had shifted, gone taut in the particular way a rope goes taut right before it either holds or snaps. And by mid-afternoon, when Vrana came by a second time to kick a spray of dust up near Jose's face for his own amusement, Boone had pushed off that post and started walking, unhurried, toward the well. That's enough. His voice wasn't loud, wasn't sharp, just flat and certain the way a man's voice gets when he's already decided a thing and isn't asking permission to believe it. Vrana turned, more startled than offended at first, because nobody in Ester Springs had spoken to him in that tone in longer than he could remember. "This ain't your business, stranger. Making it mine." He crouched by the well, ignoring Vrana entirely now, and looked at Josie's wrists, at the raw skin under the iron, at the cracked lips, and the sun-scorched color rising in her cheeks. "How long you been out here?" "Since sunup." Her voice came out rougher than she meant it to, 3 hours of silence having cost her more than she'd let on. "You oughtn't get yourself shot over a stranger's trouble." "Wouldn't be the first time." Something in the dry, almost amused flatness of it was the first hint, small as it was, that this particular stranger had more history behind those words than Ester Springs had any reason to suspect yet. Combs arrived at a near run once. Word reached him that a stranger was making trouble at the well, Kettle trailing a step behind with his hand resting nervous on his own holster. Breathless, he jabbed a finger at Boone like a man pointing out a stray dog. "This man's got no standing here, deputy. That woman's under lawful correction for theft." Boone straightened up slow, and something about the unhurried way he did it made Kettle's hand drift away from his holster rather than toward it, an instinct the deputy couldn't have explained even to himself. Funny thing about lawful usually involves a judge somewhere in the process. "I don't see one. We don't need to explain ourselves to a drifter," Combs snapped, though his voice had lost some of its earlier bravado. "No," Boone agreed. "You need to explain yourselves to her." He nodded toward Josie. "And whoever comes looking once, word of this gets past Ester Springs, which it will. Because towns that do this to a woman over a missing ledger tend to get talked about." It was here, watching the exchange, that Deputy Kettle felt the first cold thread of doubt work its way down his spine, because there was something in the stranger's economy of words, and the way he stood balanced and easy without seeming to try, that put Kettle uncomfortably in mind of stories he'd heard traded around campfires and bunkhouses over the years, stories about a particular kind of man the territory had learned, mostly through hard experience, not to provoke. He said nothing of this suspicion aloud, not yet, because saying it aloud would mean admitting he might have made a very serious mistake. and men like Kettle preferred to postpone that reckoning as long as possible. "You got until sundown," he said, mostly to Combs now, "to unlock those chains yourselves. After that, I'll do it for you, and you won't much care for how that conversation goes." He walked back to the shade of the livery without waiting on an answer, and it was that walking away, more than anything he'd said, that unsettled Combs worst of all, because a man threatening you wants to see how you react. A man simply telling you the schedule and turning his back has already decided the outcome doesn't depend on your opinion of it. Here, friend, before this story rides any further toward its reckoning, let's take a short pause, because I'd love to know where you're watching from tonight and what hour it's turned to where you are. Drop it in the comments if you would. And if this story's earned it, go on and hit that subscribe button now, because we're maybe a third of the way into this one. And the second half is going to ask a good deal more of everybody involved. Sundown came and the chains stayed locked. Combs had spent the afternoon convincing himself, with considerable help from Crab's quiet counsel and Vrana's blunt encouragement, that backing down to a nameless drifter would cost him more standing in Ester Springs than holding firm would, and pride, once it's decided a course, rarely listens to good sense until the bill comes due. Kettle posted himself near the well that evening with a shotgun, more for show than real conviction, and the town, sensing trouble building the way a sky sometimes goes a particular shade of green before a storm breaks, mostly stayed indoors with their lamps low. Boone came back across the square just as the last light went purple over the western ridge, unhurried the way he'd been all day, and Kettle raised the shotgun with hands that weren't quite steady. "Told you to leave this be, stranger. Told you I wouldn't." What happened next took perhaps 4 seconds, and every person who claimed afterward to have witnessed it clearly was almost certainly exaggerating, because it happened too fast for the plain eye to follow in any detail worth trusting. Kettle's shotgun discharged into the dirt a yard wide of where Boone had been standing an instant before, and by the time the boom finished rolling off the storefronts, Kettle found his own weapon on the ground and Boone's revolver resting easy and unhurried in his hand, not even pointed at anyone in particular. Just present, the way a fact is present. "I didn't come here looking for this." He said it quiet to the handful of townsfolk who'd come to doors and windows at the shot. "But I've got a rule about chained women and men too proud to admit a mistake, and it don't bend for local custom." He crossed to the well and, working with the same unhurried economy he'd shown all day, produced a slim tool from inside his coat, and had the iron rings sprung in under a minute, the chain falling away from Josie's raw wrists into the dust with a sound like something ending. She swayed when the weight of it left her, more from 12 hours of sun and thirst than any real weakness in her, and Boone caught her elbow, steadying her without making a show of the gesture. Water first, talk after. It was in that moment, with Josie's knees briefly unsteady beneath her, and Boone's hand firm and unhurried at her elbow, that the whole square finally understood something had shifted in Ester Springs that evening that wasn't shifting back. Combs, watching from his mercantile doorway, felt something cold settle in his stomach that had nothing to do with the evening chill, because he'd built his whole campaign against Josie Hale on the assumption that nobody in this dust-poor town had the nerve or the standing to interfere, and he'd just watched that assumption get proven wrong in under a minute by a man he'd taken, up until an hour ago, for an unremarkable drifter passing through. Now let me tell you plainly who Boone actually was, because Ester Springs was about to find out the hard way, and you, friend, deserve to know it before they do. Boone's given name, the one his mother had used and precious few others since, was Thomas Boone Calloway, and 11 years before that evening at the well, he'd been a young deputy federal marshal working the territories between the Arkansas River and the Sangre de Cristo Range, hunting men considerably worse than Elias Combs for a living. He'd built, over 6 brutal years in that work, a reputation that had outgrown his own name, until men in 3 territories spoke of the Calloway gun the way they'd speak of weather, something you planned around rather than something you argued with. He'd brought in some of the worst men the frontier produced in that stretch. Train robbers and stage line killers, and at least one particularly notorious gang of horse thieves who'd terrorized half of eastern Colorado before Callaway and two other marshals finally ran them to ground in a canyon outside Trinidad. He'd been shot twice, broken more bones than he cared to count anymore, and buried two partners along the way. And somewhere in the accumulation of all that, something in him had simply worn through. He'd walked away from the badge 4 years back, not from cowardice, not from any failure of nerve, but from a plain exhaustion of the soul that eventually catches up with men who spend too many years deciding, again and again, who lives and who doesn't. There had been a woman once, too, back in those Marshall years, a schoolteacher in Trinidad named Elizabeth, who'd loved him steady for 2 years despite the danger that trailed him everywhere he went, and who'd finally told him, gently, but without any give in it, that she couldn't spend the rest of her life waiting to hear whether the next telegram carried his name among the dead. He hadn't blamed her for leaving. He'd understood it too well, in fact, which was its own particular kind of loneliness, understanding exactly why the person you loved couldn't stay. He'd told his last captain, a man named Ruiz, who'd tried hard to talk him out of it, that he'd rather spend his remaining years being nobody in particular than keep being the man everybody in 3 territories either feared or wanted dead. He'd drifted since, working when work needed doing, moving on before anyone got too curious about his history, and he genuinely believed, riding into Ester Springs 2 days prior, that he'd found one more forgettable little town to pass quietly through on his way to nowhere special. He hadn't counted on Ester Springs testing exactly the parts of himself he'd been trying hardest to set down. Josie drank slow from the canteen Boone handed her, sitting on the well's stone lip while the square emptied out around them into wary knots of townsfolk pretending not to watch. Her hands shook. Not from fear exactly, more from the simple aftermath of 12 hours the body hadn't been built to endure. And Boone crouched beside her without crowding her, patient in the particular way of a man who understood that some kinds of hurt need silence more than sympathy. Once the water had steadied her enough to speak plain, she found her voice again. They'll come at this different now. Combs won't let this lie. Man like that, embarrassed twice in one day, he'll find some way to make it worse before he lets it go. Probably, Boone agreed. That's why we're not staying in the square tonight. We? Unless you'd rather face down Combs, Rana, and whatever the deputy's got left of his nerve on your own. She considered that a long moment, weighing the plain sense of it against the strange discomfort of owing a debt this large to a man she'd known all of an hour. I don't take charity easy. Good. This ain't charity. This is me finishing what I started when I walked over here this afternoon. Different thing entirely. They didn't go far, just to the small cabin Josie kept at the edge of town, defensible in a modest way with its single door and shuttered windows, and Boone spent the better part of that evening doing what 13 years of hard training had made into instinct, checking sight lines, testing the door's hinges, walking the perimeter twice in the dark, memorizing where the ground would carry sound and where it wouldn't. Josie watched him work with a kind of tired fascination, because it was becoming clearer by the hour that whoever this Boone actually was, he was no ordinary drifter who'd simply gotten lucky with a deputy's nerve. When he came back inside to bar the door, she watched him a moment. You've done this before. Once or twice. More than once or twice, I'm guessing. He didn't answer that directly, not yet, settling instead into the single chair by her cold hearth, his revolver within easy reach on the table beside him, his eyes tracking the shuttered window every few minutes out of habit rather than active worry. You should try to sleep. Whatever they decide to do, it won't be tonight. Combs strikes me as a man who needs time to work himself up to real trouble. She didn't sleep. Not properly, but she rested enough that when true dawn broke gray over the eastern flats, she found herself steadier than she'd expected to be. and found Boone exactly where he'd been the night before, awake, watchful, unchanged. Over the thin coffee she'd managed to brew, she finally asked it plain. "Tell me who you really are." "A man doesn't move like you moved yesterday evening without a history behind it." So he told her. Not all of it. Not the parts that still cost him something to speak aloud even 4 years distant, but enough. The badge, the 6 years, the reputation that had outgrown the man wearing it, the exhaustion that finally drove him to set it all down. He told her about Ruiz, and about the 2 partners he'd buried. One shot from ambush outside Trinidad and one dead of fever in a lined shack with nobody but Boone to sit beside him those last 2 days, and about Elizabeth, whose name he still said carefully, like a thing that might crack if handled rough, and about the particular quiet he'd been chasing ever since. A quiet Ester Springs had very nearly given him for 2 whole days before yesterday's cruelty at the well put an end to that particular peace. "You could have kept writing," Josie said again, turning the coffee cup slow between her palms. "That's twice now you've told me why you didn't, and neither answer quite explains it to my satisfaction." He was quiet a moment, weighing how much more of himself he wanted to hand over to a woman he'd known barely a day, then decided, the way he'd decided most things since walking off that porch, that half-truths weren't worth much to either of them anymore. "Truth is, I've ridden past worse than what happened to you and told myself it wasn't my fight. Man in Trinidad once, beaten near to death outside a saloon for owing money he didn't have, and I told myself the marshal's office wasn't paying me to police every cruelty in the territory, and I rode on, and it sat wrong in me ever since. I don't aim to carry that particular regret twice in one lifetime." She considered that a long while, watching the fire he'd banked low against the hearth. "That's an honest answer, at least." "Only kind worth giving," he said, "this late in a man's life." "Why step in, then? You could have ridden on. Nobody would have faulted a stranger for minding his own trail." "I would have faulted myself. Simple as that. That's the part of the badge I never managed to set down along with the rest of it. Some things, once you've spent that many years fighting them, you can't watch happen in front of you and just keep riding." By mid-morning, word had reached Combs's mercantile that the deputy had lost his shotgun and his nerve, both in the same evening, and Combs, humiliated twice over now, in front of his own town, gathered what allies he could scrape together for what he told himself was simple order, and was, underneath, plain vengeance dressed up as civic duty. Brana brought 2 of his ranch hands, men named Gus and Petey, who worked cheap and asked few questions. Crab, though he stayed carefully out of the actual gathering, made certain word reach Combs that public sentiment, properly managed, would forgive whatever happened next as long as it happened decisively. Kettle, humiliated and half convinced now that he'd crossed a man he shouldn't have, tried at first to talk Combs down from further action, only to be reminded sharply that his badge existed at Combs's convenience and could be unconvenient just as easily. "Now here's the moment, friend, where I want you to think for a moment about the ordinary folks of Ester Springs, because the story isn't only about the wolves and the woman they cornered, it's about a town discovering, hour by hour, exactly what its own silence had cost it, and whether that silence would hold a second day the way it had held the first." Some, watching from behind their shutters, had started to feel something closer to shame than fear. The blacksmith, the one who'd told himself the day before that it wasn't his place, found himself standing in his own doorway that morning with his arms crossed, watching Combs's men gather, and for the first time and longer than he wanted to admit, wondering what kind of town he actually lived in. Combs's plan, such as it was, involved cornering Boone and Josie both at the cabin before either could ride clear of Ester Springs, silencing the one witness who could carry an ugly story to the territorial marshal's office, and removing the stranger who'd made him look a fool twice in 24 hours. It was not, by any measure, a well-considered plan, built as it was on wounded pride rather than clear thinking. But wounded pride has started more frontier violence than greed ever managed. And Combs had convinced himself there was no version of this story that ended well for him unless he acted first and decisively. Boone had spent the hour before dawn doing the quiet, methodical work of a man who'd prepared for exactly this kind of morning more times than he could easily count. He walked the yard twice more in gray half-light, marking the 2 spots where a man on horseback would have to slow to round the wood pile. The low spot near the well track where hoofprints would show plain in the dust, the single stretch of open ground between the tree line and the cabin door that offered no cover to anyone crossing it at a run. He checked the borrowed rifle himself before handing it back to Josie, working the lever twice to be sure it cycled clean, and set 2 spare boxes of shells on the sill within easy reach of where he meant her to stand. It wasn't much of a fortress, 1 clapboard cabin against 5 armed men, but a good position poorly defended loses to a poor position well understood, and Boone intended Ester Springs to learn that lesson, same as everybody else who'd underestimated him over the years. "If it goes bad," he told her, checking the cabin's single window latch one final time, "you get low behind the stove, and you don't come up till you hear my voice specific calling your name. Not a shot, not a shout my voice, saying your name plain. Anything else, you stay down. And if I don't hear your voice at all..." He didn't answer that one right away, and the silence told her more than any words would have. "Then you take the horse tied out back, and you ride for the territorial seat, and you don't look behind you," he said finally. "But that ain't how this morning's going to go." They came at midday, 5 men riding loose formation up the track toward Josie's cabin, Combs at the rear where his nerve felt safest, Vrana and his 2 hired hands riding point, Kettle trailing reluctant and pale at the flank. Boone had seen them coming a full 10 minutes before they arrived, thanks to a vantage point he'd scouted at first light, specifically for that purpose, and he'd used those 10 minutes putting Josie behind the cabin's thickest wall, with the borrowed rifle he'd left with her, and a plain, clear set of instructions. "You don't have to fight," he told her, "but if it comes to it, you know which end points away from you now. Wait for my signal, and don't come out till you hear it. And if something happens to you, nothing's going to happen to me." He said it with the flat, unhurried certainty of a man who'd said those words before and meant them every time. "On account of I've done this dance longer than any of these men have been shaving." He met them in the yard rather than waiting for them to reach the cabin door, unhurried the way he'd been every moment since arriving in Ester Springs, hat brim low, hands loose at his sides in a way that looked casual and was, in truth, the most dangerous posture a man like Boone could hold. Before any of them had dismounted, he gave them the only warning he intended to give. "Turn around. Last chance I'm giving anybody today." Vrana laughed that same cruel laugh from the day before, though there was something thinner in it now, something that wanted to sound braver than it actually felt. "5 of us, 1 of you, Drifter. You sure about that math?" "Dead sure. But it ain't really about the math. It's about which of you is willing to be the first to find out I'm serious." Combs, from the back of the group, found his voice then, high and strained. "This is town business, stranger. You've no cause." He cut Combs off flat. "I've got every cause. You chained a woman to a well over a lie you told yourself to save your own pride. And now you've ridden out here with 4 other men to finish what your lie started. That's not town business. That's just cruelty with a posse attached." Gus, one of Vrana's hired hands, made the mistake of reaching first, more out of nerves than real intention, and the 4 seconds that followed would be talked about in Ester Springs for the rest of that generation. Boone's hand moved with a speed that seemed to belong to some entirely different category of man than the quiet drifter who'd shared 2 unremarkable days at the livery, and Gus's pistol went spinning from his grip before he'd cleared leather properly, a graze along his knuckles, the only wound he took for his trouble. Petey, seeing his partner disarmed and under a heartbeat, froze entirely, hands well clear of his own holster, every ounce of nerve draining straight out through his boots. Vrana, slower to learn than his own hired hands, went for his gun anyway. Pride outrunning sense the way a dozen men who spent years being the biggest threat in whatever room they occupied and never learned what it felt like to be outmatched. Boone's second shot took the revolver clean from Vrana's hand before the hammer ever fell, and the rancher went down, cursing and clutching fingers that would ache for weeks but would, at least, still be attached to his hand come morning. It was Kettle, to his limited credit, who broke first and cleanest, throwing both hands wide and backing his horse away before the shooting had even fully stopped. "I'm out," he said, voice cracking. "I never wanted this. Combs pushed the whole thing from the start, I swear it before God. That left Combs alone at the back of the yard, unarmed by his own cowardice, having never actually drawn a weapon himself in his life and having relied entirely, this whole ugly campaign, on other men's willingness to do his violence for him." He sat his horse in silence for a long moment, watching two of his hired allies disarmed and bleeding in the dirt, his deputy already halfway to disavowing the whole scheme, and something in his face crumpled from fury into a much smaller, much more honest fear. "You've no idea who you're dealing with," Combs tried. One last grasp at the authority he'd built his whole small town standing on. "I know exactly who I'm dealing with. A man who chains women to wells because he can't stand being told no to his face. I've met plenty like you over the years, Combs. You're none of you as dangerous as you think. Once somebody finally stands up who isn't scared of your paper and your bluster." It was here that Josie stepped out from behind the cabin, rifle steady in her hands despite the raw wrists still bandaged beneath her sleeves, and the sight of her standing upright and unafraid. Exactly the woman Combs had spent 3 weeks trying to convince the whole town was something lesser. Seemed to finish whatever was left of his nerve entirely. Her voice carried clean across the yard, steady in a way that surprised even her. "You lied. About the ledger, about the theft, about all of it. I want to hear you say it plain, in front of these men, or I swear I'll make certain every soul in this territory hears the truth of it from me instead." Combs looked around at Vrana nursing his hand, at Gus and Petey, disarmed and silent, at Kettle already edging his horse toward the road out, and found, for the first time in his petty, small-minded campaign against her, that there was nobody left willing to back his version of events. "The ledger was never stolen," he said finally, the words dragged out of him more by circumstance than any real remorse. "My nephew misfiled it. I said what I said because you'd humiliated me in front of my own counter, and I couldn't abide it. Say the rest." Quiet but not gentle. Combs sounded smaller now than he had in years. "I lied. I had her chained over a wounded pride and nothing else. Now, friend, I won't dress up what happened next as some grand shootout, because it wasn't. And honest stories don't need to manufacture more blood than actually spilled that day to be worth the telling. What happened next was simpler and, in its own way, harder for men like Combs and Vrana to endure, a full confession, extracted in front of witnesses who could no longer be bought off or intimidated into silence, followed by the slow, grinding machinery of actual consequence finally catching up to men who'd spent years assuming it never would. Boone rode with Josie into the territorial seat 2 days later, her wrists healing, her resolve entirely unbroken. And there they laid the whole matter before a circuit judge who happened to be passing through on his regular rotation, a different and considerably less compromised man than Whitlock, whose absence from Ester Springs that week Boone had quietly confirmed before ever agreeing to make the ride, reasoning correctly that Whitlock's long friendship with Combs would poison any hearing held under his gavel. The judge, hearing sworn testimony from Josie herself, supported by a written confession Combs had been persuaded to put to paper before Boone and Josie ever left Ester Springs, found more than enough grounds to strip Combs of his mercantile license pending a full civil suit, and to relieve Deputy Kettle of his badge entirely for dereliction and complicity both. Vrana faced a separate reckoning of his own, A civil judgment for assault that cost him 2 seasons' worth of cattle sales to satisfy, a debt that stung him considerably worse than the graze across his knuckles ever had. Whitlock himself. Once he returned from his hot springs and found the whole rotten arrangement he'd spent years quietly protecting suddenly unraveled in his absence. Discovered that a territorial inquiry into his own conduct followed close behind, and though he was never formally charged with any crime, the circuit court quietly declined to renew his commission the following spring, a small, unglamorous ending for a man who'd done as much long-term damage to Ester Springs as anyone who'd actually raised a chain that Tuesday morning. It is often that way with men like Whitlock, friend. Their punishment rarely matches the size of their sin, but it costs them something all the same. Usually the one thing men like that value most, which is the comfortable respectability they spent a lifetime building. Crabbe, slippery as ever, managed to keep his own hands officially clean throughout the whole affair, having never once raised a weapon or signed his name to anything actionable, but Ester Springs remembered, the way small towns always remember, exactly whose whispered counsel had helped push Combs toward cruelty in the first place. And the undertaker found his business considerably diminished by neighbors who'd once trusted him and now simply didn't, in ways no court could ever properly punish, but that cost him plenty all the same. It wasn't, in the end, a clean or a total justice, and I want to be honest with you about that rather than dress the story up prettier than it actually played out. Combs kept enough of his money to avoid true ruin, moving on eventually to a smaller town, 2 counties over where nobody yet knew his history. A pattern men like him tend to repeat their whole lives if given half a chance. But Ester Springs itself changed in the slower, harder way towns sometimes do after they've been forced to look honestly at their own failures. The blacksmith started speaking up at town meetings in ways he never had before. The schoolteacher, ashamed of drawing her curtains that first day, became one of the loudest voices arguing for a proper elected town council rather than a single bribable deputy holding all the authority. Small changes, none of them dramatic, but real ones, the kind that actually took root rather than simply making a good story. Josie herself stayed in Ester Springs, rebuilt what remained of her modest life, and within a year had scraped together enough, helped along by a town suddenly much more willing to support her, to open the small schoolhouse she'd always dreamed of, teaching a dozen children their letters and their sums in a single sunlit room she'd built onto the side of her own cabin. Constance Ruelle, the widow who'd stood so long at her own gate that Tuesday before turning back inside, was among the first to send her own children through that schoolhouse door. And though the 2 women never spoke directly of that particular shame, Josie found it in herself to welcome her all the same, understanding better than most the difference between a moment of failure and the whole shape of a person's character. She never fully lost the wariness that well had cost her, a certain watchfulness in crowds that never entirely faded, but she also never let that wariness curdle into bitterness, choosing instead to build something steady and useful out of the wreckage of what had nearly broken her. Boone stayed in Ester Springs longer than he'd stayed anywhere in the 4 years since he'd set down his badge, though he never fully explained to Josie or to anyone else in town exactly why. He took up work breaking horses for the same ranchers who'd once ridden with Vrana against him, a quiet irony nobody missed but nobody mentioned aloud either, and slowly, the way trust rebuilds itself in small towns when it's earned rather than demanded, Ester Springs stopped seeing him as the dangerous stranger who'd humiliated their leading men, and started seeing him as simply Boone, the quiet horsebreaker who kept mostly to himself and helped when help was needed. The blacksmith, whose name was Amos Feld and who carried his own private shame from that first Tuesday morning longer than almost anyone else in town, made a particular point of it that winter, riding out to Boone's small rented spread more than once just to sit an evening and talk of nothing important. A quiet act of penance neither man ever named aloud but both understood well enough. That's often how a town heals, friend, if it heals at all. Not with speeches or apologies delivered in the town square, but with small, unremarkable kindnesses paid out slow over months. by people trying in their own private way to become a little better than they'd been the day the well taught them exactly who they were. He and Josie built something between them that fall and winter that neither of them rushed to name, something built less on drama and more on the particular trust that grows between two people who stood together at the worst moment either of them faced and come through it whole. It wasn't a romance out of some dime novel, sudden and declared with grand speeches. It was steadier than that, and in its own way, stronger for being steady. Two people who'd each spent years being underestimated by folks who mistook their quiet for weakness, finding in each other somebody who'd finally seen them clear. There would be other towns, other stories, other men like Combs who mistook a quiet woman or a plain-dressed stranger for easy marks over the years that followed, because that particular arrogance never fully dies out of this world, no matter how many times it gets proven wrong. But Ester Springs learned its lesson the hard way that autumn of 1885, and the lesson was this: cruelty dressed up as order is still cruelty, and silence in the face of it is its own kind of guilt. And sometimes the stranger nobody bothers to notice, standing quiet at the edge of the crowd, is exactly the one who's seen enough of the world's ugliness to finally do something about it when it matters most. So here's what I want to leave you with tonight, friend. And it's a simple enough lesson, though simple never quite means easy. Don't mistake a person's quiet for their weakness, not the drifter at the edge of the square who says nothing for 2 whole days, and not the woman chained to the well who refuses to give her tormentors the satisfaction of hearing her beg. The quietest people in any room are often carrying the most, and the ones who look easiest to hurt are sometimes standing closer than anybody realizes to somebody who has already decided, a long time ago, exactly how much cruelty they're willing to watch pass by without answering it. If this story rode with you tonight, do an old storyteller the kindness of hitting that subscribe button, and tell me down in the comments where you're listening from and what the hour is where you are tonight. Stay close for the next one, because next time we're heading further south, to a border town where a bounty on the wrong man's head brings a reckoning nobody in 3 counties saw coming. Until then, friend, keep your porch light burning, keep your neighbors honest, and keep your eyes on whoever's standing quiet at the edge of your own crowd. This has been a work of fiction, inspired by the spirit of the old frontier, told to you around this fire one more night. Good night, and ride safe.